My name is Zoe Harper. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been what people like to call reliable. I live in Portland, Oregon. I've spent the last 11 years working in corporate operations for a mid-sized tech company. Nothing flashy, nothing glamorous. I'm not the face of anything. I'm not the loudest voice in meetings. I'm not the person who lights up the room. I'm the one who makes sure the room doesn't catch fire. Most people would describe me as calm, organized, low maintenance, the kind of employee every manager says they wish they had more of. I don't miss deadlines. I don't create drama. I don't demand attention. And because of that, I was easy to overlook. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about dramatic speeches or storming out of boardrooms. No one gets humiliated. No one gets destroyed. There are no villains here, at least not the cartoon kind. It's about something quieter. It's about loyalty. And what happens when you realize loyalty doesn't always equal fairness? The day I learned my salary was half of my less experienced colleagues, I didn't cry. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even react in a way anyone could see. But something in me shifted. For years, I believed that consistency would eventually be rewarded, that staying late without being asked would matter, that covering for others when they slipped would count for something, that if I just kept my head down and did excellent work, the numbers would reflect it. They didn't. What followed wasn't explosive. It was deliberate, slow, internal before it was external. This is the story of how I was perceived, how I allowed certain patterns to repeat, how I normalized small dismissals because I valued stability over confrontation, and how, once I saw the full picture, I made a choice that couldn't be undone, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I'm telling this because I know I'm not the only one who has ever sat in a conference room, nodding politely, while something inside quietly asked, "Is this really what I'm worth?" Have you ever stayed loyal to something that wasn't loyal back? In the office, I was the steady one, not the ambitious one, not the brilliant one, not the rising star, just steady. If you looked at our internal org chart, my name sat comfortably in the middle. Not junior, not executive, just high enough to carry responsibility and low enough to avoid the spotlight. When new hires joined, they were told, "If you're confused, ask Zoe. She knows how everything works." It was meant as a compliment, but what it really meant was this. I knew how everything worked, but I wasn't seen as someone who should run it. In meetings, I spoke when necessary. My suggestions were practical, efficient, implementable, and often, 6 months later, I would watch someone else present a refined version of what I had originally proposed. No one intentionally erased me. It was subtler than that. They would say things like, "Zoe's great at execution. Zoe will handle it. Zoe's so dependable." Dependable became my label. And labels are comfortable. They save people the trouble of reassessing you. If someone missed a deadline, I absorbed the gap. If a client escalated an issue, I calmed them down. If two departments clashed, I translated between them. I was the emotional shock absorber of the organization. What I wasn't was visible ambition. I didn't self-promote. I didn't schedule one-on-ones to discuss growth trajectories. I assumed my work spoke clearly enough. That assumption would cost me. There was a particular tone people used with me, warm but slightly dismissive, the way you speak to someone who will never challenge you. When budgets were tight, raises were delayed. When promotions were discussed, I was told, "You're invaluable where you are." Invaluable where I was. I used to hear that as praise. Looking back, it was containment. The younger employees, especially the charismatic ones, were mentored publicly. Their wins were announced in company-wide emails. Their potential was described in glowing adjectives. My wins were quiet. Operational efficiency increased. Client churn decreased. Internal processes stabilized. Stability isn't sexy. And because I didn't complain, I was seen as content. The truth? I wasn't content, but I was grateful. And gratitude can look a lot like acceptance. I grew up believing that security was fragile. My parents worked multiple jobs when I was a teenager. I learned early that you don't risk stability unless absolutely necessary. So when small things felt off, like being left out of strategic discussions I helped build the groundwork for, I told myself it was fine. I told myself, leadership knows what they're doing. I told myself, your time will come. And perhaps the most dangerous one, at least you're valued. I was valued, just not proportionally. To them, I was the reliable constant, the one who would never leave, the one who would never push too hard, the one who could be counted on to stay late without being asked and fix what others overlooked. I don't think anyone consciously decided I was worth less. They just never had a reason to think I might demand more. And when people assume you'll stay, they stop investing in convincing you to. That was who I was to them, not underestimated in intelligence, underestimated in self-worth. And the most dangerous thing about that kind of perception is that sometimes you start believing it too. The first time it happened, it was so small, I almost laughed at myself for noticing. It was during a quarterly strategy meeting, one of those long conference room marathons with glass walls and catered sandwiches that no one really eats. We were discussing workflow restructuring. I had spent 2 weeks analyzing inefficiencies between operations and product development. I built a clean data-backed proposal. Nothing dramatic, just numbers, timelines, projected savings. When it was my turn, I presented calmly. No theatrics, just clarity. The room nodded. A few follow-up questions. My manager, Daniel, said, "This is solid. Let's think about how to position it." Position it. 2 weeks later, the restructuring plan was introduced again, this time by Ryan. Ryan was 28, energetic, MBA from a well-known school. He had joined the company less than a year earlier. His slides looked familiar. The same process maps, the same projected percentages, the same 3-phase rollout I had drafted. But the language had changed slightly. It was framed more strategically, more visionary. The CEO leaned forward during Ryan's presentation. "This is exactly the kind of forward-thinking initiative we need." Applause. Applause followed. I sat there, hands folded neatly on the table, listening to my own structure being praised through someone else's voice. Ryan glanced at me once, quickly, not guilty, not smug, just aware. After the meeting, he approached me by the coffee machine. "Hey, I hope you don't mind. Daniel thought it would land better coming from me. You know how it is." I did know how it was. I smiled. "It's fine, as long as it gets implemented." And I meant it, mostly, because part of me genuinely cared more about results than recognition. If the system improved, didn't that matter more than who got credit? That's what I told myself. But that night, I opened my black leather notebook and wrote the date. Not dramatically, not angrily, just factually. March 14th, restructuring proposal presented by Ryan, originally drafted by me. I didn't know why I wrote it down, I just did. Over the next few weeks, subtle shifts followed. Ryan was invited to executive check-ins. His name appeared in internal updates tied to innovation initiatives. I was tasked with implementation. No one said anything disrespectful. No one dismissed me outright. In fact, Daniel told me during our one-on-one, "You're so good at operationalizing big ideas. That's a rare skill." Rare skill. I asked, gently, "Do you see me moving into more strategic ownership long-term?" He smiled in a way that felt practiced. "Let's focus on mastering where you are right now." I had been in that role for 5 years. Still, I nodded. That was the first small cut. Not because Ryan presented my work, not even because leadership praised him, but because I realized something uncomfortable. The room didn't see me as the originator of ideas. They saw me as the one who makes other people's ideas work. And once a narrative sets in, it becomes self-reinforcing. I could have pushed back. I could have asked for co-presentation. I could have corrected the room. Instead, I chose grace. Grace is admirable, but sometimes grace becomes permission. And the moment you allow a small misalignment to pass without correction, you quietly teach people how to value you. That day, I taught them I would accept being background. I didn't realize it at the time. I just told myself I was being professional. And professionalism, when overused, can become self-erasure. After that meeting, nothing exploded. No dramatic shift, no obvious demotion, no one treated me differently in my face. That's what made it so easy to normalize. Ryan's presentation became a company initiative. The restructuring rolled out over the next quarter, and I led every implementation call. I trained teams, I adjusted timelines, I solved the predictable friction points before they became visible problems. When the metrics improved, leadership congratulated the strategy team. I was copied on the email. That became the rhythm. Ryan, or sometimes someone else, would introduce ideas in rooms I wasn't invited to. I would later receive instructions to execute them. And more often than not, the ideas were expansions of frameworks I had quietly built months earlier. Each instance taken alone was defensible. "Well, Ryan communicates at a higher level. You're so strong in execution. We need different strengths in different rooms." All reasonable. And because they were reasonable, I didn't argue. Instead, I adapted. I told myself, you don't need the spotlight, you value stability. This is just how corporate ecosystems work. When annual reviews came around, my feedback was glowing. Consistently exceeds expectations. Reliable backbone of the operations team. Low maintenance, high output. Low maintenance. That phrase stayed with me longer than it should have. In performance language, it sounds positive, but translated plainly, it means she won't make this difficult for us. My raise that year was 3%. Ryan was promoted to Strategic Initiatives Lead. At the celebratory happy hour, Daniel clinked his glass and said, Ryan's vision is helping shape the future of this company. I smiled and applauded. I even hugged Ryan. And I meant the hug. He wasn't malicious. He was ambitious. There's a difference. But I began to notice something else. In meetings, when I spoke, people would nod and move on. When Ryan spoke, often echoing something I had said minutes earlier, the room leaned in. It wasn't louder. It wasn't more insightful. It was simply delivered by someone they had already decided was strategic. Narratives create gravity. Once someone is labeled visionary, their words weigh more. Once someone is labeled dependable, their words stabilize but don't elevate. I started catching myself shrinking my contributions. If I sensed an idea might be controversial, I softened it. If I felt excitement about a new direction, I tempered my tone. I didn't want to appear emotional or territorial or difficult, because women who push too visibly are rarely described as strategic. They're described as intense. So I chose composure, again. But composure, repeated without boundary, turns into quiet concession. There was a moment, small, forgettable to everyone else, that clarified this pattern. We were in a cross-functional planning call. I suggested delaying a product launch by 2 weeks due to operational risks I had identified. I laid out the data. Clear, calm. Silence followed. Ryan cleared his throat. I think what Zoe's saying is we should evaluate operational readiness before finalizing the date. The room nodded. Daniel responded, exactly. That's a smart lens. The date was delayed. My lens, his phrasing, his credit. After the call, I didn't feel angry. I felt tired. Not of the pattern, but instead of confronting it, I rationalized it. You're secure here. You're respected. Not everyone needs a title to matter. All true. And yet something subtle had shifted inside me. I stopped expecting recognition. And when you stop expecting something, you also stop noticing when it's missing. That's how disrespect becomes normalized. Not through cruelty, through repetition, through the slow conditioning of what you will and will not challenge. And I had been training them, patiently, politely, that I would challenge very little. It wasn't written anywhere. There was no official document that defined my position as supporting character. No memo announcing that I would be the operational spine while others became the face. But over time, the role solidified anyway. I was the stabilizer. When leadership debated bold moves, I was brought in afterward to assess feasibility. When timelines slipped, I was asked to work my magic. When clients escalated frustrations, I was the calm voice on the call. I became the person you call when things wobble. Reliable, useful, invisible. The irony was that I had helped design many of the systems people now relied on. I built reporting dashboards that executives referenced in board meetings. I created onboarding frameworks that reduced turnover. I restructured vendor contracts that saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars over 3 years. But when success was discussed, it was framed as team effort. When the strategy was discussed, it had a face. And that face wasn't mine. One afternoon, I overheard something I wasn't meant to hear. I was walking past Daniel's office when I caught my name mid-sentence. I didn't stop deliberately. It was just one of those moments when your body pauses before your mind does. She's not going anywhere, Daniel was saying. Zoe values stability. We can rely on her. Another voice, HR, I think, responded. So no retention risk? Daniel laughed lightly. No, she's loyal. Loyal. The word should have felt good. Instead, it felt like a ceiling. Loyal meant predictable. Predictable meant safe to deprioritize. I walked back to my desk with the same calm expression I always wore. I answered emails. I approved budgets. I scheduled follow-ups. Outwardly, nothing changed. Internally, something clarified. They didn't see me as undervalued. They saw me as settled. And maybe I had helped create that perception. I never threatened to leave. I never negotiated aggressively. I never positioned myself as someone who had options. I positioned myself as grateful. Gratitude is beautiful in personal relationships. In corporate ecosystems, it can be misread as permanence. Around that time, a new hire joined the operations team. Lena, 26, sharp, and unapologetically ambitious. During her first week, she asked me directly, "What's the promotion path here?" I smiled. "It depends on your goals." She tilted her head. "What were your goals when you started?" The question caught me off guard. I realized I hadn't revisited that in years. My original goal had been growth, leadership, influence. Somewhere along the way, it had quietly shifted to security. That shift hadn't been announced either. It had just happened. Gradually, responsibly, logically. I began to see the pattern more clearly. I was given trust, but not trajectory. Responsibility, but not authority. Expectations, but not elevation. And because I handled it gracefully, the role hardened around me. The dependable one. Every organization needs one. But no one builds statues for stabilizers. I don't say that with bitterness. It's just structural truth. The role I was assigned wasn't imposed with malice. It was shaped by convenience, by what made everyone else's lives easier, including mine. Because as long as I stayed in that lane, I never had to risk rejection. But the cost of staying useful was becoming optional in conversations about power. And I was beginning to understand something uncomfortable. If I didn't redefine my role, no one else would. The day I learned my salary was half of my less experienced colleagues, it didn't come with dramatic music or a confrontation in a glass conference room. It came in the most ordinary way possible: open enrollment week. HR had accidentally attached the wrong spreadsheet to a compensation benchmarking email. It was meant for leadership review, an internal salary comparison across roles and departments. For about 27 minutes, it sat in my inbox. I wasn't snooping, I was looking for updated healthcare contribution tiers, that's all. And then I saw my name. Base salary, $84,000. Below it, a column labeled Strategic Initiatives Lead. Ryan's name. Base salary, $168,000. I blinked. Not because I thought he was underqualified, not because I believed I should earn exactly the same, but because the gap wasn't incremental, it was structural. Half. I reread the numbers 3 times, certain I was misinterpreting them. Maybe bonuses were skewing the view. Maybe equity packages explained it. Number, the sheet was clear. 11 years at the company. 5 years in a senior operations role. Consistently exceeding expectations. Half. My body didn't react the way I expected it to. No racing heart, no shaking hands, just stillness. A very quiet, very cold clarity. I closed the file. 20 minutes later, a follow-up email arrived. Please disregard the previous attachment. Incorrect version. Of course. But you can't unsee our own mean unsee numbers. I didn't confront HR. I didn't march into Daniel's office. I didn't text a friend in outrage. Instead, I opened my black leather notebook. October 3rd. Discovered compensation gap. 2-to-1 ratio. No adjectives, no commentary, just a fact. That night, I sat at my kitchen table long after dinner, staring at nothing in particular. I replayed every late evening, every crisis I had absorbed, every time I told myself stability was enough. I wasn't angry at Ryan. His salary reflected how the company valued strategic visibility. What unsettled me was this: I had been performing strategic thinking for years. I just hadn't claimed it. I had built frameworks that others presented, mitigated risks others never saw, protected revenue streams without attaching my name to the save. And because I didn't brand it, it wasn't branded as mine. Loyalty doesn't always equal fairness. That sentence surfaced slowly, like something that had been waiting for permission to exist. I had equated loyalty with moral high ground, with long-term reward, being the bigger person. But loyalty, in a system built on leverage, is neutral. It only becomes valuable when paired with visibility or negotiation. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to ask a dangerous question. If I left, what would actually happen? The thought didn't feel rebellious. It felt analytical. What processes depended solely on me? What client relationships were anchored in my consistency? What institutional knowledge wasn't documented anywhere except in my head and my notebook? The answers came quickly, more than I had realized. And here's the part that surprised me most. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt responsible. Responsible for not questioning sooner. Responsible for mistaking appreciation for equity. Responsible for believing that being indispensable would automatically translate into being compensated proportionally. That night wasn't the beginning of revenge. It was the beginning of recalibration. Something shifted, not outwardly, but internally. For the first time, I stopped measuring my worth by how stable I could make things for everyone else. And I started measuring it by something quieter: leverage. Not to hurt anyone, but to understand my real position. Because once you see the full structure of a system, You can no longer pretend you're standing somewhere else inside it. The morning after I learned the numbers, I showed up exactly the same. Same charcoal blazer, same neat bun, same calm good morning as I passed Daniel's office. No one noticed anything different, and that was the point. Before, my silence had been habitual, automatic, the byproduct of wanting harmony. Now my silence was intentional. There's a difference between being quiet because you feel small and being quiet because you're observing. In meetings that week, I contributed less. Not dramatically, just slightly. If someone interrupted me, I didn't reclaim the floor. If Ryan rephrased my point, I didn't clarify ownership. I watched. I watched how often decisions relied on data I had curated, how often timelines shifted because I adjusted behind the scenes. How often did Daniel defer to me privately after publicly praising someone else? I began to see the architecture of dependency, and the more I saw it, the calmer I became. Not passive, calm. When Daniel asked me to work some magic on an aggressive deadline, I responded evenly, "I'll need written prioritization if this overrides existing deliverables." He blinked. It wasn't defiance. It was a procedure. "Sure," he said. "That makes sense." It always made sense. I just hadn't required it before. Silence, when paired with documentation, shifts power quietly. I stopped absorbing verbal requests without email follow-ups. I stopped fixing mistakes without flagging their origin. I stopped staying late unless it was formally acknowledged as overtime or time in lieu. No confrontation, just structure. At first, people mistook it for fatigue. "Everything okay?" Lena asked one afternoon. "Everything's clear," I replied. God, clear was the right word. Clarity doesn't shout, it reorganizes. I also began declining small emotional labor tasks that had unofficially become mine. Planning birthday celebrations, mediating personality conflicts, and onboarding new hires without formal recognition. Loop in HR for that, I would say gently. Or, that falls outside my scope. Scope, another word I hadn't enforced before. Ryan didn't notice immediately. Why would he? From his perspective, operations continued functioning. Deadlines were still met, clients were still satisfied. But that subtle friction began appearing. Projects moved a little slower without my anticipatory corrections. Cross-team communication required more explicit alignment. Daniel had to attend meetings he once skipped because I had covered them seamlessly. No one accused me of anything, because I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was simply doing exactly what my job description required. Nothing extra. And here's the truth that unsettled me most. For years, I had been performing at 130%. At 100%, I was still competent. But the system felt the missing 30%. That realization wasn't satisfying, it was sobering. Because it meant the gap in my salary wasn't due to a lack of impact. It was due to how invisibly I delivered it. One evening, as I closed my notebook, I wrote a new line beneath the compensation entry. Silence is no longer the default. Silence is a strategy. Not a strategy for destruction, strategy for alignment. If they believed I was loyal and immovable, I would let that assumption sit undisturbed. Assumptions create blind spots, and blind spots create openings. I didn't know yet what I would do with that opening, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never again offer more than I was willing to measure. And from that day forward, everything I gave had weight attached to it. The shift wasn't dramatic. If you had walked past my desk, you would have seen the same spreadsheets, the same color-coded timelines, the same quiet woman typing with measured focus. But behind the scenes, something methodical had begun. Preparation. Not emotional preparation, structural preparation. For years, I had documented processes to protect the company. Now I documented them to understand my own leverage within it. Every recurring task was mapped. Every cross-department dependency was traced. Every client relationship that defaulted to "Ask Zoe" was noted. I wasn't hoarding information, I was cataloging value. There's a difference. I created a private inventory. Not of secrets, but of contributions. Revenue preserved through risk mitigation, contracts renegotiated, escalations diffused before churn. Efficiency gains are measured quarter over quarter. I calculated conservatively, over 3 years, my operational interventions had directly or indirectly protected several $1,000,000 in revenue, not generated through flashy campaigns, protected through quiet prevention. Prevention rarely makes headlines, but it stabilizes balance sheets. I also began studying compensation architecture more seriously. Market benchmarks, title inflation trends, gender pay gap statistics within operations versus strategy roles. I didn't approach it emotionally, I approached it like a case study. Where did operations typically plateau? What narrative differentiated executor from architect? How did professionals reposition without burning bridges? In parallel, I strengthened relationships externally, former colleagues, industry peers, a recruiter I had once politely declined. Nothing dramatic, just reconnection. Would love to catch up. Curious about how your team structures strategy roles. Open to learning about market shifts. I didn't announce availability. I cultivated optionality. Optionality changes posture. When you know you have alternatives, your tone shifts, even if you never articulate it. At work, I also began delegating more deliberately. Tasks I once absorbed automatically were redistributed with documentation attached. If you're leading this initiative, I would say to Ryan, you'll want full visibility into implementation variables. I've outlined them here. He seemed grateful. He didn't notice that the outline revealed how many hidden variables I had been stabilizing for years. Daniel started asking more questions during executive reviews. Why is this timeline tighter than usual? Are we confident in risk mitigation? I answered calmly, referencing the documentation I now shared more transparently. The architecture was becoming visible, and visibility has weight. One afternoon, Lena stopped by my desk again. I don't understand how you keep all of this in your head, she said, gesturing to a complex rollout plan. I don't, I replied. I tapped my notebook. I keep it here. She laughed. Sing. You're like a walking system. That comment lingered. Walking system. Systems, when removed, leave gaps. I didn't want to create chaos. That was never my goal. I cared about the people on my team. I cared about the company's mission. But I was beginning to understand something critical. Loyalty to an organization should not require invisibility within it. And if my invisibility was sustaining disproportionate compensation, then clarity was the only ethical response to myself. By the end of that quarter, I had something I hadn't possessed before. Not anger, not resentment. Evidence. Evidence of impact. Evidence of dependency. Evidence of market disparity. And perhaps most importantly, evidence that I could leave and land somewhere else without starting over. That realization didn't inflate me. It steadied me. Because once you know you are not trapped, you stop negotiating from fear. They still believed I was loyal, predictable, immovable. They never noticed that my preparation wasn't about departure yet. It was about choice. And choice, when quiet, is the most underestimated form of power. The leverage didn't arrive in a dramatic phone call. It arrived in a conversation that almost didn't happen. A recruiter I had spoken to months earlier sent a brief message. Not sure if timing is right, but I'd value your perspective on an operations director role we're filling. Perspective. I agreed to a call during my lunch break. Sitting in my car with the engine off, notebook balanced on my knee. The role was at a slightly smaller company, but growing rapidly. They needed someone to build scalable infrastructure before expansion. The recruiter described the responsibilities, and something inside me recognized the architecture immediately. It wasn't just operations, it was a strategic operation. Cross-functional alignment, risk modeling, executive visibility. Everything I had been doing without the title. What compensation range are they targeting? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She paused briefly, as recruiters do when they're assessing your reaction before you've even given it. For the right candidate, between $165,000 and $185,000 base, plus equity. There it was again, the number. But this time, it wasn't attached to someone else's name. It was being described in reference to me. I didn't celebrate, I didn't smile, I didn't even shift in my seat. I just wrote it down. Market value, aligned with Ryan's range. We ended the call professionally, no commitments, just let's stay in touch. When I returned to the office, nothing looked different. Same hum of printers, same muted conversations, same Ryan leaning over someone's desk, explaining a slide deck. But I saw the room differently, not as my only ecosystem, as one option among several. That psychological shift was more powerful than the salary number itself. For years, my loyalty had been tied to fear. Fear of instability, fear of starting over, fear of risking what I had built. Now fear had been replaced with information. Information dismantles illusions. The illusion that I needed this exact company to maintain security. The illusion that external markets wouldn't value my skill set. The illusion that quiet contribution was only measurable internally. That evening, I reviewed my documentation again. Not to prepare a resignation letter, but to assess timing. If I left abruptly, projects would stall, clients would feel it, my team would scramble. I didn't want to create collateral damage, but I also no longer felt obligated to protect leadership from the consequences of structural undervaluation. There's a difference between caring about people and shielding systems. I cared about people. The system, that was transactional. Over the next few weeks, I had 2 more conversations. Informational interviews, technically, but each one mirrored the first. Titles higher than mine. Compensation aligned with strategic roles. Interest in my systems thinking. One hiring manager said something that stayed with me. You don't talk like an operations manager. You talk like an architect. Architect. I had never used that word for myself because in my current company, the architect implied vision and vision implied spotlight. But externally, the language shifted. I began to understand that my invisibility wasn't a reflection of my capability. It was a reflection of context, and context can be changed. The private reveal wasn't about an offer letter. Not yet. It was about calibration. I now knew, objectively, that my compensation wasn't an unfortunate oversight. It was a structural underestimation. Not malicious, not personal. Structural. And structural gaps require structural decisions. I didn't rush, I didn't confront. I let the knowledge settle into me like weight redistributing evenly across a scale. For the first time in 11 years, I wasn't operating from gratitude. I was operating from clarity. And clarity doesn't demand noise. It demands alignment. Clarity creates a crossroads. And crossroads are quieter than people think. There was no cinematic moment where I stared out of a rain-streaked window and whispered, "It's time." There was just a spreadsheet open on my laptop one Sunday afternoon. Column A, stay. Column B, negotiate. Column C, leave. I approached the decision the way I approached operations, without emotion first. Emotion would follow. Stay. Pros, stability. Familiar systems, predictable workload. Cons, structural undervaluation. Limited upward mobility. Narrative already fixed. If I stayed without addressing compensation, I would be accepting the architecture as permanent. And I knew myself well enough to understand what that would do over time. Resentment doesn't explode immediately, it calcifies. Negotiate. Pros, potential salary adjustment. Recognition of value. Cons, requires revealing leverage. Risk of being placated, not re-leveled. I imagined the conversation with Daniel. I could present market data. I could outline contributions. I could reference an expanded scope. And perhaps they would offer a raise. But would they double it? Unlikely. And even if they came close, something deeper had shifted. I wasn't just negotiating salary, I was negotiating narrative. Could a company that had quietly categorized me as loyal and stable suddenly see me as strategic and architect level without years of cognitive bias to undo? Possible, but improbable. Then there was leave. Pros: market-aligned compensation, title recalibration, fresh narrative. Cons: risk, transition discomfort, letting go of a decade of identity. Leaving meant something irreversible. Not dramatic, irreversible. I wouldn't be the steady constant anymore. I wouldn't be the walking system people leaned on. I wouldn't be the quiet backbone. And I realized something uncomfortable. Part of me liked being indispensable. Being needed feels powerful in its own way. But indispensable and undervalued can coexist. That's the trap. One evening after work, Daniel stopped by my desk. "Hey," he said casually, "we're thinking about expanding Ryan's team next quarter. Might shift some responsibilities your way temporarily." Temporarily. More scope. Same title. Same pay. He smiled the way managers do when they believe they're offering growth. Thoughts? I met his eyes evenly. I'll need to understand how expanded responsibilities would be leveled and compensated. He paused, just briefly. "We can discuss that later," he said. "Let's focus on impact first." Impact first, compensation later. I nodded politely. And in that moment, my decision crystallized. Not emotionally, but structurally. If I negotiated now, it would be reactive, triggered by additional workload. If I stayed, I would be reinforcing a pattern I had already diagnosed. Leaving was the only option that reset the frame entirely, not as punishment. As recalibration, the irreversible option wasn't about proving a point. It was about refusing to continue participating in a system that had quietly halved my worth on paper. That night, I closed the spreadsheet. Column C remained highlighted. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. And steady, this time, meant something different. It meant I was choosing myself. Not in defiance, but in alignment. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural. No dramatic countdown, no visible detachment. Just execution. I scheduled final round interviews using personal time off. I updated my resume. Not with inflated language, But with quantified outcomes, I had once considered just part of the job. Reduced operational costs by 18%, improved client retention by 24%, designed a cross-functional workflow adopted company-wide. Reading my own contributions in bullet form felt strange. For years, they had lived as tasks. Now they read like strategy. 2 weeks later, the offer arrived. Director of Strategic Operations. Base salary, $178,000. Equity. Signing bonus. The number didn't make me emotional. The alignment did. The title reflected what I had already been doing. The compensation reflected the market's acknowledgement of it. I didn't accept immediately. I reviewed the contract line by line, non-compete clauses, equity vesting schedule, reporting structure. Quiet dominance isn't impulsive, it's thorough. When I finally signed, I didn't celebrate publicly. I didn't update LinkedIn. I didn't tell coworkers. I drafted my transition plan instead. Every active project is documented. Every dependency is mapped. Every risk is outlined. Not because I owed the company perfection, but because I owed myself integrity. I scheduled a meeting with Daniel for the following Tuesday morning. I slept well the night before. When I walked into his office, he smiled. "What's up?" I placed a single printed letter on his desk. "I've accepted another opportunity," I said evenly. "My last day will be 4 weeks from today. I've prepared a full transition plan to ensure continuity." Silence. Not anger, not shocked. Disorientation. "I didn't realize you were looking," he said carefully. "I wasn't," I replied, "until I was." He leaned back in his chair, processing. "Is this about growth? We could explore expanding your role." There it was. Expansion without prior initiative. "I appreciate that," I said. "But the new role aligns with the scope I've already been operating at." He frowned slightly. "Compensation?" "Yes." Direct, no accusation. He exhaled. "We didn't know you were unhappy." "Unhappy. I wasn't unhappy," I clarified. I was underleveled. The distinction mattered. He looked at the letter again. "Can we counter?" 4 months ago, that question might have flattered me. Now it felt late. "I've already committed," I said calmly. That was the irreversible part. I hadn't used the external offer as leverage. I hadn't initiated a bidding war. I hadn't asked them to match numbers. Because this wasn't about squeezing more from the same structure. It was about stepping into a different one. The next few days were quiet but charged. Word spread slowly. Meetings shifted tone. Questions increased. Ryan stopped by my desk. "I didn't know you were considering leaving," he said, genuine confusion in his voice. "I wasn't," I repeated, "until I evaluated my options." He nodded slowly, as if recalculating something internally. They hadn't seen it coming. Not because I was secretive, but because they believed loyalty was permanent. And loyalty, when unexamined, looks like immovability. They mistook my steadiness for permanence. That was their blind spot. And I had moved through it without noise. The first week after my resignation announcement felt deceptively normal. Emails still arrived, meetings still filled my calendar, deadlines still existed. But beneath the surface, the ecosystem had shifted. When you remove an assumption, especially one that's lasted 11 years, the structure wobbles. Daniel began attending operational syncs he had skipped for years. He asked more granular questions than usual. Why does this approval require 3 checkpoints? Who typically resolves this escalation? I answered calmly, referencing the documentation I had already shared. It requires 3 checkpoints because, without them, vendor error rates increased by 12% last year. I typically resolve that escalation directly with the client to prevent churn. He nodded, slower each time. The invisible threads were becoming visible. Ryan scheduled a one-on-one with me. "I want to make sure I fully understand your frameworks before you go," he said. There was no arrogance in his voice now, just urgency. We sat side by side at my desk as I walked him through risk matrices, cross-team alignment maps, contingency plans that had never been formally requested, but had always existed. "You built all of this?" he asked at one point. "Yes." He leaned back slightly. "I thought operations just handled things as they came." I smiled faintly. "That's the goal. If it looks reactive, it's already too late." For the first time, I saw something shift in his expression. Not guilt. Respect recalibrating. By the second week, friction began appearing in places I used to smooth automatically. A vendor contract stalled because no one knew the informal negotiation history. A product launch meeting ran over by 40 minutes because risk scenarios hadn't been pre-modeled. A client escalated an issue directly to Daniel because I wasn't immediately available. None of these were catastrophic, but they were inefficient. And inefficiency is loud when people are used to seamlessness. HR requested an exit interview. Is there anything we could have done differently to retain you? The representative asked. I considered the question carefully. Yes, I said. Regular market benchmarking for internal roles. Clear leveling criteria tied to scope, not personality. She wrote that down. Was this primarily about compensation? It was about alignment, I replied. Compensation was the symptom. Misclassification was the condition. By week 3, leadership held a closed-door meeting I wasn't invited to. I knew because calendars shifted abruptly. And afterward, Daniel's tone carried an edge of strain. He stopped by my desk late one afternoon. We're realizing how much institutional knowledge lives with you, he admitted quietly. I nodded. That's why I'm documenting everything. He hesitated. I wish we'd had this conversation earlier. So did I. But wishing doesn't retroactively rebalance numbers. I wasn't enjoying their discomfort. That part surprised me. I expected some satisfaction, some validation. Instead, I felt something calmer. Confirmation. The system hadn't undervalued me because I lacked impact. It had undervalued me because my impact was too smooth to interrogate. Now that smoothness was leaving, the texture underneath was being felt for the first time. Not painfully, but noticeably. And sometimes that's enough. By the 4th week, the tone had shifted from confusion to urgency. Not a public urgency. The company still functioned. Clients were still served. Deadlines were still technically met. But internally, I could feel the recalculations happening. Daniel asked to meet again, this time with HR present. The invitation itself told me what I needed to know. When I entered the room, there was a new softness in the way they spoke to me. Not condescending, careful. Zoe, Daniel began, hands folded on the table. We've been reviewing your scope more closely. I almost smiled at the phrasing. More closely. As a result, HR continued, we believe your current leveling may not fully reflect your contributions. May not fully reflect. Corporate language is fascinating. It wraps structural admissions in polite understatement. Daniel leaned forward. We'd like to discuss a compensation adjustment and title revision, effective immediately if you're open to reconsidering. There it was. Not expansion, not vague growth trajectory. Immediate adjustment. I let the silence stretch. Not as a tactic, but because I wanted to feel the weight of the moment fully. 4 weeks ago, this conversation would have felt like victory. Now it felt like evidence. What would the revised structure look like? I asked evenly. They outlined the proposal. A significant salary increase, a new title, Director of Operations Strategy, retroactive bonus adjustment. It was generous. It was also reactive. I listened without interrupting. When they finished, Daniel added, we truly value you. We don't want to lose you over something we can fix. Something we can fix. That's where the misunderstanding lived. This wasn't a typo on a paycheck. It wasn't a missed bonus cycle. It wasn't an accidental oversight. It was a decade-long narrative. And narratives don't shift simply because someone finally measures them. I appreciate the offer, I said calmly. It means a lot that you've reviewed my scope. HR nodded, hopeful. But I've already committed to my next role, I continued. And this decision wasn't made in a moment of frustration. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. If it's about trust, we can rebuild that. I shook my head gently. It's not about trust, it's about alignment. They were quiet. I operated at this scope for years, I added. The adjustment is thoughtful, but it confirms that the misalignment existed. No accusation, just a fact. HR tried once more. Would you consider staying if we matched the external offer? The external offer. They still didn't know the exact number. I met their eyes steadily. This isn't about matching, it's about context. I need to step into a space where my role is defined correctly from the beginning. There was nothing hostile in my tone, and that's what made it final. Panic is loud, acceptance is quiet. By the end of the meeting, they understood. Not emotionally, structurally. They had waited until departure to evaluate equity. And equity evaluated too late becomes a retention attempt, not recognition. When I walked out of that room, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt complete. Some opportunities expire not because they aren't valuable, but because they arrived after the internal decision was already made. My last Friday arrived without ceremony. No dramatic farewell speech. No tearful exits. Just a conference room booked for a final handoff meeting. Daniel, Ryan, HR, and 2 senior team members sat across from me, laptops open, notepads ready. It wasn't positioned as a confrontation, but there were questions hanging in the air that hadn't been asked directly yet. After we reviewed transition items, Daniel closed his laptop slowly. Before you go, he said, I'd like to understand something more clearly. I waited. Did we undervalue you? The question wasn't defensive, it was careful. I could have softened it. I could have protected his comfort. For years, I would have. Instead, I answered plainly, yes. No sharpness, no edge, just truth. Ryan shifted slightly in his seat. HR remained still. Why didn't you say something earlier? He asked. Wow, that question deserved honesty too. Because I believed consistency would eventually be recognized proportionally, I replied. And because I prioritized stability over negotiation. Silence followed. Ryan spoke next. I never realized the gap was that wide. I know, I said, this wasn't personal. And I meant it. Ryan had operated within the narrative given to him. He had advocated for himself the way ambitious professionals are taught to. I had operated within a different narrative, the dependable one. Daniel leaned forward again. If you had brought market data to us a year ago, we could have corrected this. I held his gaze. Would you have? Not challenging, just curious. He paused. I'd like to think so, he said finally. That uncertainty is part of the answer, I replied gently. There was no accusation in the room, just a shared recognition of how systems drift when unexamined. I don't regret my time here, I continued. I learned how to build resilient structures. I learned how to lead without noise, but I also learned that loyalty doesn't always equal fairness. The sentence settled over the table. No one argued with it. HR closed her notebook. Is there anything you'd advise us to change? Yes, I said. Don't wait for someone to resign before evaluating their scope, especially the quiet ones. Ryan nodded slowly. I misread your silence, he admitted. That's fair, I replied. I misused it. Kinyai. That was the closest thing to a confrontation we had. No raised voices, no blame, no humiliation. Just clarity shared across a table where, for years, my contributions had blended into background stability. When the meeting ended, Daniel stood. You built more here than we realized, he said quietly. I know, I answered. Not proud, not bitter. Certain. And certainly when spoken without heat, it leaves very little room for argument. My first day in the new role felt unfamiliar in a way that was almost disorienting. Not because the work was harder, because the room was different. In my first executive meeting, I presented a risk model for an upcoming expansion. I spoke the way I always had, clear, measured, structured, but this time no one redirected my language through someone else. No one rebranded my insight. The CEO asked follow-up questions directly to me. The CFO referenced my framework by name. Zoe's model indicates 3 potential volatility points, he said. Zoe's model. I hadn't changed my voice. The context had changed. The title on my email signature read Director of Strategic Operations. It didn't inflate me. It simply matched the scope I was already comfortable carrying. Compensation aligned too. But interestingly, the money settled faster than the identity shifted. For weeks, I caught myself defaulting to old habits. Over-preparing to justify my presence, softening suggestions to avoid appearing assertive, taking on emotional labor tasks out of reflex. Then I would pause. That reflex belonged to a previous environment. Here, I was hired for architecture, not stabilization alone. And slowly, I allowed myself to occupy that space fully. Not louder, just unapologetic. One afternoon, a junior manager hesitated before challenging my timeline projection. It's okay, I told her. If you disagree, say it directly. That's how we refine system. I realized then that leadership isn't about volume. It's about creating environments where clarity isn't punished. I no longer measure my value by how much I can absorb quietly. I measure it by how well I define boundaries before absorption becomes expectation. The most surprising part of this transition wasn't the salary. It was the relief. Relief of not performing invisibility. Relief of not waiting to be recognized. Relief of knowing that if misalignment appears again, I won't need 11 years to address it. I don't resent my former company. They operated within a structure common to many organizations. Reward visibility, assume loyalty, adjust only when prompted. I participated in that structure too, but I'm not the same participant anymore. The woman who once believed gratitude required silence has been recalibrated. Now gratitude and self-advocacy coexist. Now loyalty is conditional on reciprocity. Now silence is still part of my personality, but it's chosen, not defaulted. If someone were to describe me today, I suspect they would still use words like calm, analytical, steady. But there's something new underneath that steadiness. Ownership, not of a company, of my worth. And that ownership doesn't require announcement. It shows up in how I negotiate, how I document, how I leave when alignment dissolves. I'm still reliable. I'm just no longer invisible. If you had asked me years ago what loyalty meant, I would have said commitment, consistency, staying when things were hard. I still believe those things matter, But I understand something now that I didn't then. Loyalty without alignment slowly turns into self-discounting. I wasn't mistreated in obvious ways. I wasn't shouted at, I wasn't sabotaged, I was praised, trusted, relied upon. And still, I was paid half of my less experienced colleague's salary, not because I lacked value, not because I lacked intelligence, but because I allowed my value to be categorized narrowly and I didn't challenge the category. That's the uncomfortable part of this story. There wasn't a villain, there was a system, there was a narrative, and there was my participation in both. The moment everything changed wasn't when I resigned. It wasn't when they offered to counter. It was the moment I saw the numbers and chose not to look away. Clarity can feel colder than anger, but it's more useful. I didn't leave to punish anyone. I left because staying would have required me to continue pretending the gap was acceptable. And once you know your market value, once you understand your real scope, you can't unknow it. Loyalty doesn't always equal fairness. Fairness requires measurement, conversation, boundaries. It requires the courage to ask, is this proportional? And if the answer is no, it requires the courage to adjust, not emotionally, but structurally. If you're the reliable one, the steady one, the person everyone depends on but rarely spotlights, I hope you don't wait 11 years to audit your own worth, not to create conflict, but to create alignment. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever confused being needed with being valued? And if you looked at your own numbers today, would they tell the same story you've been telling yourself?
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.